morning. It's nice to be here with you this morning. So this morning I invite you to a posture of expansiveness, to create space in your heart and mind. So you may take a deep breath, open your hands, find comfort in your seat. Perhaps uncross your legs. Allow there to be a connection to God and that which is beyond yourself by opening up the final energy flow called the crown chakra. Sunday morning can be hurried, especially Sunday mornings like today. And by allowing yourself to be here in this place so that the crown chakra, this energy flow, can be a spiritual guide that helps us receive intuitive information. When the crown chakra is open, we feel connected to something greater than ourselves and experience a sense of cosmic consciousness. Allow yourself to be a deep and wide well of overflowing, living water this morning. We just heard this story of the Samaritan woman and Jesus at the well. What do you know about this story? What comes to mind? You don't have to answer, but just think about it. Be curious about each of the characters, the place, perhaps the surroundings, and maybe what the weather was like that day. I wanted our liturgists this morning to practice and model this kind of curiosity. When we encounter a biblical story that we may know so well, we are invited to look again with curiosity. According to Brené Brown in her book, The Atlas of the Heart, who has that here, by the way? Does anybody have that? I have a copy in the narthex if you want to look at it. It's a really cool book. But she says, curiosity is recognizing a gap in our knowledge about something that interests us and becoming emotionally and cognitively invested in closing that gap through exploration and learning. So there is no right or wrong answer to what you know about this story. But sometimes it is helpful to be curious about a tried and true story like this one. Curiosity is the gateway to broadening our understanding of something that might not make sense or seem too complicated to unpack. Or it is so familiar that we don't even pay attention anymore. Sometimes when we learn a story as a young person, those themes stick. Those lessons get ingrained in us. And sometimes we don't stop to think, I wonder if the story might have a different meaning to me now, with more life lived, wisdom gained, and relationships acquired and lost. We have much to learn from just this one Bible story and the woman at the well. She was curious and had the courage to engage when the situation just seemed too complicated to unpack. So in this story, like many other lessons Jesus teaches, we learn that there is always enough. There are enough loaves and fishes, enough talents, enough love, enough water in the well. We learn that we are called to risk and have courage and be curious about others. We learn that we are called to do this over and over again, because that's what Jesus taught the disciples. And he taught them to teach others and to teach others, and so that there are ripple effects. We learn that there are not just some people that are called to spread the good news. We are called as Christians, all of us, to spread the good news. So we are invited. We are invited to be curious and wonder and have awe, to create an expansiveness in our hearts and minds and souls. Jesus was great in this story, but the woman was extraordinary. Jesus approaches a Samaritan woman by himself. He challenges her, and she challenges him back. He loves it, and she is perplexed. This is one of the things I love about this passage. Maybe because I like to challenge too, so I feel this woman. Each of them is important enough to the other for this kind of engagement, interrogation, curiosity, and wonder. So let me be extra clear about this interaction at the well. There are multiple layers of marginalizations and intersections of discrimination against this woman. It is the ancient world, and it is this kind of interaction is unusual. Jesus could have and should have ignored her according to societal norms. Jesus had gender considerations, racial considerations, and low socioeconomic status considerations with this woman. And at the time of their meeting, she was not married to the man she was living with. He could easily have ignored her, but he chose not to. She easily could have left in shame, but she chose not to. Because I'm a new preacher here at Plymouth, I want to share some of my processes with you in reading and gleaning wisdom from the biblical text. For me, I create images and pictures in my mind, and I step into the story. Brené Brown also writes that we have to have some level of knowledge or awareness before we can become curious. We aren't curious about something we are unaware of or know nothing about. So we must prime the pump. So, I know something about the Bible, but the way I prime the pump is that I imagine myself as one of the people that have central roles in the Bible, in the story. Sometimes it's the blind man or one of the disciples, but in this case, it's the woman at the well. When I mentally step into the scene at a large stone well, the first thing I felt was a racing heartbeat. She must have been so nervous. How did she muster the courage to talk to this stranger who seemed to know so much about her? And then Jesus had a strong confidence and a quiet yet extremely perceptive presence. At least that's what I'm imagining. I might have been wowed by Jesus, and because, I'm Italian and East Coast, I was probably also ridiculously suspicious of this man. Like, who does he think he is? It's kind of arrogant, right? But once I'm in the text and I begin to identify with the lived experience of the ancient character, I begin to have empathy. And I wonder how the experience of the woman at the well could connect with my own experiences in contemporary America. And this is when my narrow understanding of the world begins to expand. This is when the living waters of Jesus' well overflow. I make sense of my own life through these sacred texts, and I have a woman at the well experience. My lens broadens, my faith deepens, and my love of God and God's world expands. I'm going to get a little personal. For many years, much of my ministry in the church was behind the scenes. I organized and created resources for others to then present. I was very comfortable behind the scenes. I loved it. And I also had a call to expand my sense of ministry. I felt a call to amplify my work. So I decided I would start by joining the kids on the chancel steps, by telling them Bible stories. The problem is that I literally was so scared to get up in front of the congregation and talk. I was even scared to read text word for word. It has a name, and it's called glossophobia, a fear of public speaking. I know, I'm not kidding. Actually, even one person said, "Why are you in this work if you're so scared of this?" I would experience a full-on panic attack. I can point to many things in my life that caused this kind of fear. Some of it was societal norms and expectations that I learned, like the woman at the well. I didn't have very many women clergy to look up to. Some of it was shame, like the woman at the well, because I was introverted. I'm kind of an introvert-extrovert, or an extrovert-introvert, but definitely the introvert is there. And our culture really likes extroverts. Some of it was growing up with a parent where English is a second language and communication is not always with super articulate words. I was afraid and scared, and I had to cut through my shame like the woman at the well. I had to stand there exposed, vulnerable, and still open to possibility. It wasn't easy. But nevertheless, I trusted this expansive spirit of living water. Like the woman at the well, I realized, despite everything, I too had a call. I no longer needed the well water, but rather embodied the living water. I became a deep, wide well. Like the woman at the well, I did not run back to the city to begin my work evangelizing, but rather week after week on those chancel steps, I practiced. It was a very gracious congregation. I finally knew that I was enough and that there was enough and that I was called. There is no barrier that Jesus cannot cross to embrace a relationship with someone or even call them to spread the good news. There is no barrier. When we open our hearts and our minds and our souls and allow for the overflowing living water of Jesus, And sometimes that can look like hard conversations, interrogations, arguments, vulnerability, and shame. I found this story about expansiveness in water. Former Vedic monk Jay Shetty wrote a book called Think Like a Monk. In the book, he writes a story that goes like this. "What brings you to me?" asked the old woman of the young man who stood before her. The young man said, "I see joy and beauty around me, but from a distance. My own life is full of pain." The wise woman was silent, and she slowly poured a cup of water for the sad young man and handed it to him. And then she held out a bowl of salt. And she said, "Pour some of the salt into the water." So the young man then took a small pinch of the salt, and she said, more, a handful. Looking skeptical, the young man put a scoop of salt into the cup. The old woman gestured with her head, instructing the young man to drink. He took a sip of the water, made a face, and spat it onto the dirt. "How was it?" the old woman asked. He's like, "Thanks, but no thanks." And he was kind of glum about it. The old woman smiled knowingly and then handed the young man the bowl of salt and led him to a nearby lake. The water was clear and cold. "Now put a handful of salt into the lake," she said. The young man did, and as he was instructed, and the salt dissolved into the water. "Have a drink," the old woman said. The young man knelt at the water's edge and slurped from his hands. When he looked up, the old woman asked, "How was it?" "Refreshing," said the young man. "Could you taste the salt?" asked the wise woman. The young man smiled sheepishly. "Not at all," he said. The old woman knelt next to the man, helped herself to some water, and said, "The salt is the pain of life. It is constant, but if you put it in a small glass, it tastes bitter. If you put it in a lake, you can't taste it. Expand your senses, expand your world, and the pain will diminish. Don't be a glass, become the lake." The early Eastern Orthodox tradition named the woman at the well Fioriti. For them, she became more than shameful. She was more than that shameful woman at the well. She had a name. She was no longer invisible. She became more than a Samaritan who could not speak with the Jews. She became more than a woman who had 5 husbands, so they say. She became much grander than a small well of water. Fioriti is recorded, while not 100% accurate, as being baptized by the disciples, and she spent her life evangelizing, converting countless people and towns to Christianity, not only in Samaria but beyond. Fioriti turned salty, bitter water into a large, refreshing lake. Because Jesus was curious. Because she was curious. This week, in the 3rd week of Lent, I invite you to expand your senses and your world. Who will you give a drink to? Who will you drink with? Who will you take a drink from? Amen.